Two hikers scanning the forest floor with metal detectors in eastern Germany. A quiet Saturday morning in the Brandenburg woods. Nothing unusual. Then, the detector screamed. Not the faint hum of a shell casing or a belt buckle, but a deep, sustained tone that meant something big was buried underneath. They started digging through roots and decades of dead leaves, expecting maybe an old ammunition box or a buried helmet. Instead, their shovels hit concrete, then rusted steel. A hatch sealed shut by 80 years of corrosion and forest debris. When they finally pried it open, the air that rose from below was cold and stale, like breathing in a sealed tomb. What they found down there wasn't just another wartime relic. It was a fully intact underground bunker, and inside it, the personal belongings of a man who had vanished from history in the spring of 1945. No body was ever recovered. No grave was ever marked. No Allied intelligence report ever confirmed his capture. No Soviet prison record bore his name. For 8 decades, General Lieutenant Werner von Kessler existed only as a footnote in the chaos of the Reich's final days. One of thousands of German officers who simply disappeared when the world burned around them. His family searched, filed inquiries, wrote letters to every agency that might have answers. Nothing. He was declared dead in absentia in 1956, and the file was closed. But files don't stay closed forever, and forests don't keep their secrets forever either. What those two hikers uncovered beneath the Brandenburg soil would finally answer the question that had haunted the von Kessler family for 3 generations. What happened to the general? And why did he choose to vanish? His name was Werner Friedrich von Kessler, born 1896 in Potsdam to one of Prussia's oldest military families. His grandfather had served under Bismarck. His father bled at Verdun. Werner himself was commissioned as a lieutenant at 18 and sent straight into the trenches of the Western Front, where he earned an Iron Cross before his 20th birthday. War wasn't something the von Kesslers debated. It was the family business. Between the wars, Werner rose steadily through the ranks of the Reichswehr. He married Margarete, daughter of a Berlin industrialist. They had 2 children, a son, Friedrich, and a daughter, Elisa. By all accounts, he was a disciplined officer, a devoted father, and a man who believed deeply in duty to country. But duty became complicated when the country changed around him. Werner von Kessler was not a Nazi. He never joined the party. But he wasn't a resistance fighter either. He didn't plot against Hitler, didn't pass secrets to the Allies, didn't whisper dissent in private meetings. He did what thousands of career officers did. He served. He followed orders. He looked the other way when looking directly at what was happening became unbearable. By early 1945, Werner held command of a depleted infantry division on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were pushing west with terrifying momentum. Berlin was weeks from falling. Officers around him were being executed for retreating without authorization. Others were surrendering in secret. A few were simply walking away from their posts and disappearing into the civilian population. Werner von Kessler watched all of this. And somewhere between duty and survival, he made a decision that no one would understand for 80 years. April 1945. Germany was dying. The Eastern Front hadn't just collapsed, it had disintegrated. Soviet Marshal Zhukov's armies were less than 50 miles from Berlin, grinding westward through towns that no longer existed. Behind them, nothing but scorched earth and silence. The Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging men by the thousands. Entire divisions surrendered overnight. Supply lines had been cut weeks ago. Soldiers fought with empty rifles and hollow eyes, knowing the war was lost, but terrified of what came next. In Berlin, Hitler raged in his bunker, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Move the 12th Army here. Redeploy the 9th there. Generals who pointed out that these units had been destroyed were relieved of command, or worse. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner executed his own retreating soldiers and hung their bodies from lampposts with signs reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland." This was the reality of April 1945. Obedience meant death. Retreat meant death. Even survival was treated as treason. Some officers chose surrender, slipping through the lines to find American or British forces, knowing that Soviet captivity meant labor camps or execution. Others burned their uniforms, shaved their heads, and melted into the flood of refugees, choking every road heading west. A few simply vanished. No surrender, no capture, no body. They stepped out of history and into nothing. The paranoia was suffocating. The SS had roving execution squads hunting deserters. Neighbors reported neighbors. A missing officer could mean defection, betrayal, or conspiracy. Trust evaporated overnight. In those final weeks, Germany wasn't just losing a war, it was eating itself alive. And somewhere inside that madness, Werner von Kessler made his choice. On April 14, 1945, Werner von Kessler received orders via field radio. Report to a defensive position along the Zillow Heights east of Berlin. Hold the line against the coming Soviet offensive. Reinforce what remained of the 56th Panzer Corps. The orders were almost absurd. The Zillow Heights would become one of the bloodiest battles of the war's final days. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were about to crash into German defenses that were already broken. The men being sent there weren't reinforcements. They were sacrifices. Kessler knew it. For 2 days he maintained radio contact with Wehrmacht command. Short transmissions, status reports, requests for supplies that would never arrive. Then on the evening of April 16th, he sent one final message to his adjutant, Major Heinrich Brandt. The message was brief and unusually personal for military communication. The line is gone. Protect the family. Destroy this frequency. Brandt later told Allied interrogators he assumed von Kessler meant the defensive line had fallen. But something about the wording troubled him. It didn't sound like a field report. It sounded like a goodbye. After that transmission, Werner von Kessler ceased to exist in the military record. His name appeared on no further dispatches. No casualty report listed him among the dead at Salo. No prisoner manifest placed him in Soviet hands. No Allied intelligence file recorded his surrender or capture. He simply stopped. In the chaos of those final weeks, nobody noticed. Thousands of officers vanished from the chain of command in April 1945. Records were burned. Headquarters were overrun. Communication networks collapsed. One missing Generalleutnant was barely a footnote in the avalanche of destruction swallowing the Reich whole. Werner von Kessler had stepped out of the war and into 80 years of silence. When the war ended, the Allies began the enormous task of accounting for the dead, the captured, and the missing. Lists were compiled, thousands of them. Names of German officers sorted by rank, unit, and last known location. Werner von Kessler's name appeared on one such list, maintained by the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps. Status unknown. Last confirmed communication, April 16, 1945. No further information available. That was it. 3 lines on a typewritten page, buried in a filing cabinet among tens of thousands of similar entries. In the chaos of post-war Germany, one missing general barely registered. The Americans had bigger priorities. Denazification. The Nuremberg trials. Rebuilding an entire continent from rubble. The Soviets were contacted through official channels. Their response was terse. No record of capture, no record of detention, No further information available. The British had nothing either. Margaretha von Kessler began writing letters in the summer of 1945 to the Red Cross, to Allied occupation authorities, to anyone who might know what had happened to her husband. The replies, when they came at all, were form letters. "We regret to inform you that we have no information regarding the whereabouts of your husband." She wrote again, and again. Year after year, the same letters, the same silence. By 1950, the trail was stone cold. Germany was divided. Records that might have held answers were locked behind the Iron Curtain, inaccessible to Western investigators. Former colleagues who might have known something were dead, imprisoned, or had reinvented themselves as civilians with no interest in discussing the past. In 1956, a German court officially declared Werner von Kessler dead in absentia. Cause of death unknown. Place of death unknown. The file was closed. But for the family, closure was the one thing that declaration couldn't provide. Margaret never remarried. She kept Werner's study exactly as he'd left it, his books on the shelf, his reading glasses on the desk, a photograph of their wedding day in a silver frame that she polished every Sunday. She told the children their father was a good man who had been swallowed by a terrible time. But she never said he was dead, not once, not even after the court declaration. She always said missing, as if the word itself kept a door open that she couldn't bear to close. Friedrich, the eldest, took it differently. He was 14 when his father disappeared, old enough to understand what the war had done, but too young to process the absence that followed. He grew up angry. Angry at the Allies for not searching harder. Angry at Germany for the war itself. Angry at his father for leaving without explanation. He refused to talk about Werner. When his own children asked about their grandfather, he changed the subject. Elise was only 7 when she last saw her father. Her memories of him were fragments. The smell of tobacco, a deep voice reading to her before bed, being lifted onto his shoulders in the garden. She spent her entire life trying to fill in the gaps. Did he flee to Argentina, like the rumors said about so many officers? Was he executed by the SS for desertion, dragged into a forest and shot? Was he lying in an unmarked Soviet mass grave somewhere in Poland or East Germany? The not knowing was its own kind of cruelty. Grief needs a destination, a grave to visit, a date to mark, a story with an ending, even a terrible one. The von Kessler family had none of that. Just silence, stretching across decades. Elise once told her own daughter, "I could have accepted anything, anything at all, except not knowing." That void followed 3 generations of von Kesslers, until 2 strangers with metal detectors walked into a forest in Brandenburg and finally broke the silence. The Brandenburg woods stretch across hundreds of square kilometers of former East Germany. Dense pine and birch, packed so tightly that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor in summer. In winter, the canopy holds the darkness like a ceiling. It is the kind of place where things disappear and stay disappeared. During the Cold War, much of this forest was restricted territory. Soviet military installations dotted the landscape. Ammunition depots, communications bases, training grounds surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed soldiers. Entire villages that had existed for centuries were emptied and swallowed by the military zone. For 45 years, ordinary Germans couldn't set foot in these woods without risking arrest or worse. After reunification in 1990, the restricted zones were officially opened. But officially and practically are very different things. The Soviets left behind unexploded ordnance, contaminated soil, and crumbling infrastructure that made large sections of the forest genuinely dangerous. Warning signs still stand at certain trailheads. Rusted fencing pokes through the undergrowth like bones through skin. Most people stayed away, but the locals always talked. Old farmers in the surrounding villages told stories passed down from their parents and grandparents. Strange concrete structures glimpsed through the trees. Ventilation pipes sticking out of the ground in places where no building had ever stood. Sounds coming from underground during the war years that nobody could explain. Most of these stories were dismissed as folklore or attributed to Soviet construction. But some of the older residents insisted the structures predated the Soviets, that they were German, built during the war, hidden on purpose. For decades, nobody investigated these claims. The forest was too vast, too dense, and too dangerous to search systematically. Whatever secrets it held, it kept them well. Until it didn't. Marcus Ehler and Tobias Frank were not professionals. They were weekend hobbyists, two friends in their early 40s who spent their Saturdays scanning farmers' fields and forest paths with metal detectors, looking for old coins, belt buckles, and the occasional wartime shell casing. They had a YouTube channel with a modest following. Nothing special, just two guys who liked history and didn't mind getting dirty. On September 14, 2025, they decided to try a section of forest they'd never explored before. A stretch of dense woodland, about 30 kilometers southeast of Berlin, that had been part of the old Soviet restricted zone. The terrain was rough. Fallen trees blocked every path. The undergrowth was so thick they had to push through it sideways in places. Most detectorists would have turned around. Marcus and Tobias kept going. At approximately 11:40 in the morning, Tobias's detector gave a reading unlike anything he'd heard before. Not the sharp ping of a small metal object, but a low, sustained tone that suggested something massive buried just below the surface. They started digging. Within minutes, their shovels scraped against concrete, then steel. A flat metal surface, roughly 2 feet across, sealed with corrosion and packed with decades of soil and root systems. They thought it was Soviet. That was the assumption with anything you found in these woods. Old Cold War infrastructure, left behind and forgotten. But when they finally leveraged the hatch open and shone a flashlight into the darkness below, what they saw stopped them cold. A Wehrmacht eagle stamped into a metal plate on the wall. Faded Gothic lettering on a rusted equipment locker. And on a small wooden table, sitting undisturbed for 80 years, a leather-bound journal with the initials WVK embossed on the cover. This wasn't Soviet. This wasn't Cold War. This was something much older, and it had been waiting down there in the dark for a very long time. Marcus went down first. A rusted ladder, bolted into the concrete wall, descended about 8 feet into the darkness. His flashlight swept across the space, and what it revealed made him call Tobias down immediately. The bunker was small, roughly 12 feet by 10 feet. Reinforced concrete walls poured thick enough to survive a direct artillery hit. A low ceiling that forced both men to duck slightly as they moved. The air was cold and heavy, with the smell of damp earth and decay. A ventilation shaft, no wider than a drain pipe, ran upward through the ceiling, its opening long since clogged with roots and soil. Against the far wall sat a military cot. The canvas had rotted away, leaving only the metal frame collapsed on one side where the bolts had corroded through. Beside it, a wooden shelf unit held the remnants of canned food. The tins had disintegrated almost entirely, leaving only circular rust stains and the faintest traces of paper labels. Whatever provisions had been stored here were consumed or destroyed by time decades ago. A German military radio set sat on a narrow table. The torn.fu.d2 model, standard Wehrmacht field communications equipment. Its dials frozen in place, its wiring corroded beyond function. Beside it, a stack of maps pinned to the wall with small nails. Topographical maps of Brandenburg and the surrounding regions. Certain locations were circled in pencil, routes marked with thin lines. Notes in the margins too faded to read in the dim light. But it was the personal effects that told the real story. A monogrammed silver cigarette case, engraved with the initials WVK. A leather officer's satchel, cracked and brittle with age. Inside it, a waterproof document container holding military identification papers, discharge forms that were never filed, and a folded photograph of a woman and 2 children. And on the small wooden table, sitting exactly where it had been placed 80 years earlier, the journal. The journal was bound in dark leather, swollen with moisture, and warped by decades of underground humidity. Many pages had fused together. Others had been consumed by mold, leaving only fragments of sentences. But enough survived. Enough to finally tell the story that 80 years of silence had buried. The handwriting was formal and precise, the script of a man trained in Prussian military academies, where penmanship was treated as a reflection of discipline. The earliest legible entry was dated April 15, 1945, one day before his final radio transmission to Major Brandt. The war is finished. Anyone who cannot see this is blind or lying. I will not send more men to die for a cause that died months ago. I will not stand before a Soviet tribunal. I will not hang from a lamppost for the crime of surviving. There is another way. The entries that followed described his preparations in clinical detail. The bunker had been constructed in late 1944, on his orders, by a small team of military engineers who believed they were building a fallback communications post. Only Kessler knew its true purpose. He had stockpiled provisions for approximately 6 weeks: canned meat, dried bread, water in sealed containers, enough to outlast what he estimated would be the final phase of hostilities. But by late April, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting less controlled. May 3rd. Water supply lower than calculated. Ventilation shaft partially blocked. Difficult to breathe at times. I think of Margaret and the children constantly. May 9th. The war must be over by now. I hear nothing above. No artillery, no engines, only silence. I do not know if this means peace or something worse. May 14th. Food is nearly gone. I am weakening. If someone finds this, know that I did not run. I stayed. I simply chose to stop. After that, the pages were blank. Marcus and Tobias didn't touch anything else. They sealed the hatch, climbed out, and called the police. Within hours, the Brandenburg forest was swarming with vehicles that had no business being on a dirt logging road. Local police first, then federal investigators from the Bundeskriminalamt, then a team from the German War Graves Commission. By the following morning, forensic archaeologists from the University of Berlin had arrived, along with military historians specializing in the final months of the Third Reich. The site was cordoned off and treated as both a crime scene and an archaeological excavation. Every item was photographed, catalogued, and carefully removed. The identification papers found in the waterproof container confirmed what the monogrammed cigarette case had already suggested. This bunker had belonged to Generalleutnant Werner Friedrich von Kessler. But papers alone weren't enough. Documents could be planted. Personal effects could be stolen or staged. The investigators needed biological evidence. They found it in traces of human material on the cot frame and embedded in the fabric remnants of the leather satchel's interior lining. Degraded but not destroyed. The forensic team extracted DNA samples and began the painstaking process of comparison. Kessler's son, Friedrich, had died in 2011, But his daughter Elise, now 87 and living in a care facility near Munich, was still alive. Her granddaughter, Katharina, agreed to provide a DNA sample on the family's behalf. The testing took weeks. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, followed by more advanced nuclear DNA extraction from the degraded samples. The laboratory at the University of Freiburg ran the comparison 3 times to eliminate any possibility of error. Each time the results came back the same. The probability of a familial match was overwhelming. The bunker's occupant and Elise von Kessler shared a direct patrilineal line. After 80 years, the science had caught up with the silence. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Katharina von Kessler was at work when her phone rang. A representative from the German War Graves Commission, speaking in the careful, measured tone of someone trained to deliver news that changes lives. The remains and personal effects recovered from the Brandenburg site had been positively linked to her great-grandfather, Generalleutnant Werner von Kessler. The case was closed. After 80 years, the family finally had an answer. Katharina drove straight to the care facility in Munich. She sat beside her grandmother's bed and held her hand and told her what they'd found: the bunker, the journal, the maps on the walls, and the photograph of Margaret and the children still folded inside the satchel where he'd kept it close to him until the very end. Elisa didn't speak for a long time. She was 87 years old. She had spent 80 of those years not knowing. 8 decades of silence that had shaped every part of her life. The anger of her brother Friedrich, who went to his own grave without answers. The quiet endurance of her mother, Margaret, who kept that study untouched and never once used the word dead. The void that sat at the center of every family gathering, every Christmas, every birthday, where his absence was felt but never explained. When Elise finally spoke, her voice was steady. "He didn't leave us," she said. "He just couldn't come back." The journal was delivered to the family 2 weeks later. Katharina read the final entries aloud to her grandmother. The words of a man writing alone, underground, in the dark, thinking about the people he loved, and wondering if they would ever know what happened to him. Elise listened with her eyes closed, tears running silently down her face. Not tears of sadness exactly, something closer to relief. The unbearable weight of not knowing had finally been lifted. It had taken 80 years, 3 generations, and 2 strangers with metal detectors, but the silence was over. With the journal, the physical evidence, and decades of historical research, investigators were finally able to reconstruct Werner von Kessler's last days with reasonable certainty. The picture that emerged was neither heroic nor villainous. It was something far more complicated. It was human. In late 1944, as the war turned irreversibly against Germany, Kessler had quietly ordered the construction of the bunker. He'd chosen the location carefully: dense forest, far from any major road or railway line. Deep enough inside what he likely anticipated would become Soviet-controlled territory that no one would think to search there. He told the engineers it was a fallback communications post. They had no reason to question a general. When his final orders came on April 14, 1945, sending him to the slaughter at Salo Heights, Kessler made his decision. He maintained radio contact for 2 days to avoid suspicion. Then he transmitted his last message to Major Brandt, destroyed his communications equipment, and walked into the Brandenburg woods, alone, carrying only what he could fit in his satchel: a photograph of his family, his identification papers, the journal, and enough provisions to last what he estimated would be 6 weeks. He wasn't fleeing to Argentina. He wasn't defecting to the Allies. He wasn't joining a resistance cell or plotting some final act of sabotage. He was hiding, waiting for the chaos to pass so he could emerge into whatever came next and find his family. But the provisions ran out faster than expected. The ventilation shaft became blocked. His health deteriorated in the cold, damp darkness underground. The journal entries tell the rest. A man growing weaker day by day, writing less and less, thinking about his wife and children. He never made it out. The bunker he'd built to save his life became the place where he lost it. Not to a bullet, not to a tribunal, but to silence and starvation, and the terrible mathematics of survival when the numbers simply don't add up. Werner von Kessler was not unique. That's the part of this story that stays with you long after the details fade. In the final weeks of the Second World War, an estimated 1.3 million German military personnel were classified as missing. Not confirmed dead, not captured, not surrendered, simply gone. Vanished into the wreckage of a collapsing empire. Most were eventually accounted for, identified in mass graves, found on prisoner lists released decades later by Soviet archives, matched to unidentified remains through dental records or personal effects. But thousands were never found. Their names sit on lists maintained by the German Red Cross and the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräbervorsorge, the German War Graves Commission. Names without graves, files without endings, families without answers. Some of these men fled. The rat lines to South America are well documented: Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Officers who reinvented themselves on distant continents and lived out quiet lives under assumed names. Others were executed in the final spasm of Nazi terror, shot by the SS for desertion, hanged from bridges with cardboard signs around their necks, buried in ditches that nobody ever thought to dig up. But some did exactly what Werner von Kessler did. They hid. In basements and barns and forest bunkers, in root cellars beneath farmhouses, in mine shafts sealed from the inside. They waited for the storm to pass. And for some of them, the storm never did. They died alone in the dark, and the world moved on without ever knowing where they'd gone. Every few years, another discovery surfaces. A skeleton in a collapsed cellar in Saxony. Military equipment buried in a Bavarian forest. Dog tags pulled from a riverbed in Brandenburg. Each one represents a life that ended without witness. A family that never got answers. A file that was closed but never truly finished. Kessler's story is one of thousands. But it's also a reminder that history doesn't end when the textbooks say it does. Sometimes it waits, buried under concrete and corrosion and 80 years of forest growth, waiting for someone to come along with a metal detector and a free Saturday morning and finally dig it up. The Brandenburg forest stands the same today as it did 80 years ago. Dense, silent, indifferent to the lives that pass beneath its canopy. The trees don't care about wars or generals or families torn apart by history. They simply grow, roots pushing deeper into the soil, branches reaching higher toward the light, covering whatever lies beneath with another year of leaves, another layer of forgetting. For 80 years, that forest kept Werner von Kessler's secret. It swallowed his bunker the way it swallows everything. Slowly, patiently, completely. The hatch disappeared under decades of undergrowth. The ventilation shaft clogged with roots. The concrete settled deeper into the earth until there was nothing left on the surface to suggest that anything had ever been there at all. Just trees and silence, and the slow, patient work of nature, erasing what men leave behind. Werner von Kessler spent his entire life following orders. As a boy in Potsdam, as a young officer in the trenches, as a general in a war he knew was lost. every decision made for him by someone above him in the chain of command. But in April 1945, when the chain finally broke, he made one decision that was entirely his own. He chose to vanish. Not out of cowardice, not out of heroism, but out of something more fundamental than either. The simple, desperate need to survive long enough to see his family again. He never did, and his family paid the price of that silence for 3 generations. Margaret, polishing a silver photograph frame every Sunday. Friedrich, refusing to speak his father's name. Elise, spending 80 years trapped in the space between missing and dead. A family defined not by what they knew, but by what they couldn't. But now the silence is broken. The forest gave him up. And in doing so, it gave the von Kessler family the one thing they had been waiting for all along. Not justice, not understanding, just an ending. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes, after 80 years of not knowing, an ending is everything. Werner von Kessler's story isn't just about a general who disappeared. It's about what happens to the people left behind when someone chooses to vanish. The grief that has no destination. The questions that have no answers. The empty chair at every table that no one ever moves, because moving it would mean accepting something no one is ready to accept. In the end, the greatest mysteries aren't about what happened to someone. They're about what was happening inside them when they made the choice that changed everything. Werner von Kessler walked into a forest in 1945, carrying a photograph of the people he loved most in the world. He never walked out. But 80 years later, 2 strangers with metal detectors did what decades of searching and silence could not. They found him, and in finding him, they gave his family the only thing that was ever missing: the truth. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.